I'm Chris.
I'm Steve.
And we're talking about some deep shit. And we're back again. How's it going, Steve?
I'm doing good, Chris. How you doing?
Not too bad. I've been looking forward to talking about some more deep shit.
Me too.
So we've got a great show lined up. Thank you for joining us once again. What we want to talk about today is the idea of, are we the first civilization to make a good dent in the game of civilization on this planet, or was there another one?
I like the way you propose it.
It sounds like a crazy theory at first, because when you first say that, people, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. But the more you think of it, the idea of a lost civilization before ours has some merit to it.
Yeah. The whole realm, the whole discussion is pretty interesting. And I think that to look at how old the planet is, how old our civilization is, where we look back to the first civilization, there's a lot of questions and a lot of interesting things to talk about.
Oh, yes. I mean, that's a good point to start, is this Earth has been here a long time. And often we throw out words like million, billion, and trillion, and we do it so casually with the same lack of forethought that we do 10,000, 100,000, 200,000, 5. We kind of assume that million and billion are right next to each other. So it's an easy hop, and then billion to trillion, well, that's another easy hop. But I found an interesting stat that kind of brought that into focus. 1 million seconds is 12 days. So if you count on 1 million seconds from now, it'll be 12 days. How long do you think 1 billion seconds is?
A year.
31 years.
Wow.
So,
see,
I mean, so when you comprehend that a million is that small in comparison to 1 billion, but people say it like it's right next to each other, like they don't even think. 12 days to 31 years. Do you know how long 1 trillion seconds is?
No.
It's 31,688 years.
Wow.
Opposed to the 31 years of 1 billion seconds. When they say the planet's been here so many billions of years, and you talk millions of years for this, it's bigger numbers than you think. So that's the first aspect of it. Then you consider that anatomically modern humans, meaning humans that looked similar to us, have been around for about 196,000 years. That's a long time.
It's a long time, but not a long time when you look at how long the planet's been here.
Right, exactly. It's a fraction of a moment compared to how long the planet's been here. But there's another thought. In the last 5 or 6 generations, we've gone from riding on horseback to launching things into space on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Your grandparents, and I'm sure my grandparents, they lived at a time when their grandparents were like on horseback.
Yeah.
So that's 5 generations. So let's even go 10 generations. 10 generations from now, no electricity, it was very primitive time. So 196,000 years is almost 8,000 generations.
It's almost unimaginable
that we just sat around for 8,000 generations twiddling our thumbs, and then at some point in the last 5,000 years, so let's say, 7,995 generation, whatever, sometime in the last bunch of years, we went, hey, maybe we should start civilization. That'd be a good idea, right?
Well, yeah, it's almost like everyone got together 5,000 years ago and said, hey, what about math?
Yeah. Hey, we always carry our food around and hunt. How about we plant? And it seems like that makes sense to us, that one day about approximately 5,000 years ago, suddenly we said, oh, we're tired of wandering around for the last 190,000 years. I think we should settle down and build some stuff.
And we're going to build it in ways that no one's ever going to figure out.
Yes, there is that as well, right? There's questions about some of the ancient architecture. We'll probably get into that at some point, whether in this episode or a follow-up episode. We'll probably touch on it a little here, but there are some interesting things. People dismiss those. Skeptics will dismiss that as being just like coincidence, but it does get pretty interesting when you look into it. So that's the one question, is why did civilization wait so long to start? There is a theory. It was first proposed that I heard of. I'm sure someone else may have had it as well. But Graham Hancock, in a book in 1995 called Fingerprint of the Gods, he was the first one that I had ever seen bring that up. Have you ever read that book?
I have not read that book.
It's the seeds of a lot of this stuff, but because it was 1995, 1996, a lot of the science has come out since then that just bolster that argument. But his argument basically was, his supposition was, about 12,000 years ago, there is a question mark of why it suddenly got colder, and yet at the same time the oceans rose by 400 feet. Happened suddenly, geologically speaking. And so his theory was that there may have been a civilization that existed, and they were wiped out virtually in a cataclysm that basically brought everybody back to ground zero. And the few survivors went out there and tried to piece together their old civilization with what they had left. And that is what we think of as the beginning of civilization, when really it was the beginnings of a restart.
Based on that theory, some people call Graham Hancock a pseudo-archaeologist. Even though he's not really an archaeologist, he's more of a reporter.
Right. Pseudoscientist is another one.
Pseudoscientist. And it's interesting only because he has come out with his theories, and his theories change over time. He's rebooted them based on new evidence.
He's willing to admit that some roads of thought he went down proved to be wrong, and he fixed them. That's actually a good thing.
Oh, I think it's admirable. But some of the things he has said or written about, I should say, and he's done both, the science as it's coming out lends itself to maybe showing that it's not this crackpot idea.
Right. The resistance to it has been archaeologists primarily, because their main argument was, one is there's no evidence of a civilization. We can find evidence of a civilization around 5,000 years ago. Obviously, that's when it started, and to them. And also, there's nothing that could show that a civilization existed. And if they did exist, why wouldn't we find anything? So that was their first kind of line of thought. It was kind of a circular argument, because they were kind of saying, we don't think it exists, therefore we're not ever going to look for it because we're pretty sure it doesn't exist. So that kind of seems like a weird thought. So they'd call him a pseudoscientist or a pseudo-archaeologist. And as you said, he's a reporter. He admits this. He says, I am not a scientist. I am not an archaeologist. I am a reporter who puts together the information. Here it is. Here is where it's sourced from. Draw your conclusions. And I think they don't like that because they want the only conclusions to be their conclusions.
Right. So the civilization you were talking about earlier, some people believe that was Atlantis.
Right. That's when Atlantis comes into the conversation, right?
And I know just saying that, sometimes people say, oh, God, was this, Aquaman? What is this? Ancient civilizations are interesting to me because there are so many little pieces that kind of fit in with other stories as you go along. So, okay. So you say, all right, Atlantis, the theory is to be believed that there was a cataclysmic event that caused massive flooding, which we can talk about is almost in every culture's history across this planet.
Or at least they're fables.
They're fables. I mean, you're right. I mean, that's all they have for history. When you go back far enough, it's just fables, right? Because it's just word of mouth, basically, that got passed on from elders to elders. But Atlantis, they were supposed to be highly intelligent. Something happens, they disperse. Just a few of them survive. It kind of lends itself when you look at the way other civilizations started.
Right.
Because there's no explanation. And we'll talk about it, but right. Everyone talks about Mesopotamia. The Sumerians were the cradle of civilization. To this day, not one archaeologist can state where their language came from.
No, there's a lot of gaps in the archaeologist knowledge because that's where you get into the history, prehistory comparison. History is written. We know it happened. Somebody was there. Somebody recorded it. You can obviously argue about how much of history is, exaggerated or lied. But at least we know events happened. We may not know the full story, but we have a pretty good idea of the timeline. You go back far enough, there is no timeline. Everything we quote unquote know is because somebody pieced it together from available evidence and made a theory that was then supported by others. That's what we know of the ancient world. So we learn about a lot of this in school, but it is still theories. A lot of them are solid because they have a lot of supporting evidence. There's stuff to back it up. There's some writing, depending on where you go. But there's a lot of gaps that we just sort of fill in, archaeologists just sort of fill in, and we learn about it in school as if it's the way it happened. And the truth is, nobody really knows the way it happened.
No, we know a little bit.
Of course.
We know a little bit of what we can find. We know this. We know there are animals here. We know this, the other thing. But there's a lot we don't know.
We don't like the idea, and when I say we, I'm just talking about society in general. Like, a lot of people are resistant to the idea of there having been a civilization before us. They just instinctively, the idea strikes them as distasteful.
When you say that, I'm assuming you mean a civilization before what we can see and look at as being in our history books or being taught to us by archaeologists. What you're saying is is there something before the Egyptians?
Right.
Is it something before the Sumerians?
Was there something before? Hey, you could even say, was there several somethings before? Because the reality is, as geologists are starting to uncover, that this Earth has gone through some stuff in the more recent history. I mean, the one everyone always hears about, and it's the one that's mentioned in every article, is 65 million years ago, an asteroid killed the dinosaurs, right? Or comet. Do they call it a comet or an asteroid? I think they call it a comet.
Well, comet is water, right? It's ice.
Well, it's still something floating through space. Something hit, but I can't remember. I think it might be a comet. But they also call it an asteroid. So I'm not exactly sure. But basically, that's the one we're all taught to accept, which itself was hotly contested not even that long ago. Like, the idea that an asteroid or comet, that something hit the Earth and killed off the dinosaurs, was rejected by archaeologists of that time. And it wasn't until they discovered the crater that was accepted. So it's assumed now that it's true, but for a long time, people resist it. And they do that with new ideas up until the point that they say, oh, yeah, that is right. And then we just pretend like, oh, we knew that. We always go to that and say, that's when it happened. And it hasn't happened since. And that's 65 million years ago. And you know what? It's not going to happen again for another 65 million years. So don't worry about it. When you really go, well, do we know that's the only time it happened? And do we really know that it's not going to happen again? So that's part of it, is people don't even want to think that that's a thing because it scares them.
Right. And we know that's not the only time it's happened.
No.
We know that the Earth has been struck on many other occasions and it's caused significant damage to the Earth. And we also know that even just probably sometime soon, there'll be another asteroid flying by this planet. And some of them we don't even see until after they go past us.
Right.
Because they're coming from the direction of the sun.
If they're coming from the direction of the sun, we cannot detect them, because the only way they detect these things is they see light bouncing off them. That's how they know that something's out there. And if it's coming from certain directions, we can't see it. So we hear about them after they pass safely. We always hear that in the news. You'll see a couple of these stories here and there where they'll say, oh, an asteroid whizzed by us at, and they'll give some distance, and they'll say, but that's really far. Don't worry about that. And oh yeah, we didn't see it until like the day before. So, but don't worry about it. It's fine. And then the question that's left dangling, like, well, if we didn't see that one that was going to miss us, how can you say in that same article we're 100% sure we're safe for another X number of years? Because they often say that.
Right. They're just playing the odds.
Right. But they don't know that. So archaeologists always looked at ruins and things they dug up, and they said, we can't dig up anything from beyond 5,000 years ago. Ergo, 5,000 years ago must have been when it all started, or else we would find something. But then you take into account that at one point, the oceans were 400 feet lower. And when you raise the oceans up by 400 feet, like 12,000 years ago in that time frame, so much land ends up underwater that it's almost 10 million square miles of land that once was above the ocean is now under the ocean. That's the size of Europe and China together.
Wow.
Don't we assume, and where's a lot of that land going to come from? That's going to come from the coast, right? When the ocean level rises, it eats up the coast.
And that's where probably most development civilizations were located.
Right. That's where we started ours 5,000 years ago. So wouldn't you assume that if there was another civilization, they probably were on coasts and islands, many of which now are beneath the waves, and the destruction that went on, there's not going to be a hell of a lot left.
No. I mean, even today, Chris, most major metropolitan areas are on the coast.
Right.
That's just the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
And if, let's just say, I mean, it's not, knock on wood, it's not going to happen, but let's just say we had a cataclysmic event tomorrow. Do you think that our houses made of wood and our roads made of asphalt and our buildings, they're not going to last? Give it 100 years, give it 1,000 years. Everything's gone.
Right. There was a series on, I don't know if it was History Channel. It might have been. It was called Life After People.
Oh, yeah.
So it was like a 2-hour special at first, and then they actually like spun it off into like a series. But I saw the 2-hour special, and basically it postulated, said, what if we humans just disappeared one day? Didn't really specify. It just said, one day we're here, one day we're gone. What's left and what happens with it? And it talked about things like animals, like dogs would be in trouble, especially dogs that are kept because they're not capable of, hunting and things like that. And basically our buildings and how things would start to break down. And they gave the time frame for it all, but basically it was around 10,000 years or something like that. It might even have been 5,000, but some number of 1,000 years, there would be zero evidence that we were even here. Like somebody could show up and go, hey, this is a nice planet. I don't know why somebody didn't set up shop here, because all of what we've built, with maybe a couple of exceptions, I think Mount Rushmore and the pyramids, I believe, are the only two things that they said would still survive. Everything else made by man would be completely wiped away, whether it be, subsumed by the earth, crumbled to dust, whatever it is. There'd be no evidence we were here, but they'd see, hey, why are there some faces on a hill?
Right. And try putting those two things together.
Right. Right. The story that future archaeologists will piece together by the pyramids and Mount Rushmore, that'll be an interesting tale. They'll be like, well, they were a race of giant people who like to put their likeness on the sides of hills, but they also like triangles. We don't know why. We believe it was a ritual thing. That's when archaeologists find something in a puzzle, it's a ritual thing. Like, what did they probably used it in some sort of ritual. They would say that about like a pen if like they didn't know years from now, like, what is this thing? Well, they used it in some sort of ritual.
Right. They just don't want to say, I don't know.
Right. They don't like to say, I don't know. They like to say, well, we have serious evidence that it's this. But but there's a resistance to the very idea. There's a thought that all this is about us. Like, that's very strongly built into our thing. Like, our definition of ourselves very much hinges on where we came from. So the idea that this was all about us. The earth was put here for us, and we have, apparently hung around for some 190,000 years just sort of chilling. But at some point we said, you know what? Now it's time. This earth that was made for us, we're going to get serious. We're going to start planting stuff. We're going to start growing stuff and not hunting anymore and build cities. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. But it was all about us. And then if you say, well, no, we're the restart, that makes people uncomfortable because then the story's not about us anymore.
Right. Although, it kind of is, if you think about it, because it's almost about maybe there were just a few survivors from each time one of these things happened. So it's still a little bit of us, if you think about it that way, right? Yeah. So there's probably more than two ways of looking at it, but my brain tells me there's two ways of looking at it. One is humans have been around for, call it 200,000 years, right? And for the first 195,000 years, they said, hey, I like living in the forest. I like living in the jungle. I like killing my animals. I like eating them. And I like keep moving around. And I live in a tent. And then somehow at around 5,000 years, they decided to say, hey, let's build roads. Let's build schools. I don't know why I have this compulsion. I just want to do it. Look at all this math. Watch all the geometry I know. Right? So that is what the story is for us. Or the story could be there's more to it.
Right. It's funny how when you say it like that, when you really piece it together like that, it makes no logical sense. Like it really doesn't. I remember learning about Egypt in school, and I remember learning about, the Old Kingdom, and then it was the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, Cleopatra, all that things. We can't conceive of how long that is. The Old Kingdom was like 2500 BCE, before Common Era. And
what's crazy is Cleopatra is closer to us, our time, than when Egypt started.
Right. That is the crazy part. Right. Because at the Old Kingdom, when we think Egypt started, is like 2500 BC. Yet when we think of Egypt and the Romans and Alexander the Great, that kind of thing, that's like in 332 BC. But then later on, like it's like 30. It's
BCE.
BCE, yeah.
Which I learned is before Common Era. I've always said BC.
Right, which is before Christ.
And because CE is the Common Era, right?
But it's the same number, right?
It's AD. AD, Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of the Lord.
Yes. So they did the BCE to take away the religious connotations, but they did nothing with the AD.
No. So now it's called CE. Instead of AD, I guess.
Oh, it's CE, Common Era.
So it's BCE and then CE.
Oh,
that's
right.
I guess that's the way they use it now.
But essentially the numbers are the same, right? They're still going from year zero, like birth of Christ. They're just not calling it that.
Which always makes me laugh because I always wonder, the people that were living at the time, did they know it was year zero?
Right.
Did they say that? Hey, guys, what year is it? It's 1.
Yeah, I keep, damn it, I keep writing -1 on all my checks.
I keep messing this up. It's 2 now. I didn't know it was 2.
Yeah, we just assumed that everyone fell right into line. Like, well, what, were we starting over? Yeah, what came before? Yeah. Don't worry about it. It's year 0.
Yeah. And
everybody has their own little calendar, and they're all going like, well, we have to buy new calendars? Come on, man. That's the way we date it.
Yeah, there's people in China like, why is this a different year? Well, there was this kid born in Jerusalem.
But my point was, one of the things we learned about Egypt was that the best stuff of Egypt was the earliest. So it's almost like Egypt came out of the gate really strong. Like one day they weren't building anything, and then all of a sudden they were building all sorts of stuff, and it was crazy stuff. And then as time went on, they still built that stuff, but it wasn't quite as good. Quality declined the later you get into Egypt.
Which doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make nothing works like that.
Based on the context we know, what tradesmen over generations get worse?
Right, and starts off like awesome. That's right. But that does make sense if you say the start of it, some of the people had been around for what was before, so they had some knowledge. But over time, as those people obviously passed, and as the future generations came on, they only had what they were taught, not the core of the knowledge, some of which was lost. So that's why it explains the decline perfectly, that, okay, this person was around, these people were around to teach us, and we did really good stuff. Probably not as good as what was here before, but still pretty good stuff. But as they were no longer here, and our own craftsmen were trying to piece together what was what, it wasn't the same quality. It makes perfect sense when you say a lost civilization. Like it lines up.
It does. Well, I guess then the interesting part about that would be, where did they come from? But we don't know, because if that civilization existed, nobody really knows much about it.
Right, what came pre-Egyptians.
Right. I was talking about if Atlantis was real. Nobody knows where they even came from. Nobody's proven they even exist yet.
Right, and could you even prove that it exists? If the land that they existed on is now underwater, potentially buried, also having been swept away in a flood, that, as you said, every major culture has the same story in their ancient texts about a huge flood. Could that really be just a pure coincidence?
It's either, well, I like to say that. It isn't either, but my mind says that.
Binary. So we think in binary terms. It's either this or that.
Well, it makes my arguments better. The Sumerians, they have their legend, Epic of Gilgamesh. That's a flood. So did the authors of the Bible steal that? Or did they just have other knowledge that they knew what happened too?
And then you come to some of the ancient religions of even like the Native Americans, and you go far enough back, they speak of things like floods and massive, like every single culture has that talk.
Right.
It makes you say, well, there's probably some basis of fact there. I mean, I'm sure that some of it's exaggerated, maybe.
Right. But, and then it all sounds just so grandiose when you talk about it. Where did this flood come from? How long did it rain? Why did this happen? But if you actually go back and look at the history of the planet, more than half of it, especially in the northern hemisphere, was glaciated. And then it melted. So the question is, what scale did it melt at? And did that cause a flood because if it melted too fast? So if you have all these people around the world talking, at least in their fables, how you put it, that there was this flood, well, you know what? If you talk to 10 people and 10 people give you the same story, it starts sounding something in my brain.
Right. It may not be the exact story, but at least there's a basis there. There's something there. Right. When you look at the fact that during that period of time, I think they say it's around 12,000 years ago, they call it the Younger Dryas, but basically it was very cold. The temperature then took a dip, but at the same time, a massive amount of water was released. And they can tell all this geologically now, which is bringing up a lot of these inconvenient facts when geologists look at it and say, well, we know now from core samples that this went on at this time frame. So it got colder, but also water flooded into the oceans and sea levels went up by 400 feet. How do you reconcile those two things? Because if it got colder, you would think there'd be more ice, there'd be less water. But it got colder, but it also got wetter. So that leads one to the conclusion that, well, if something hit the ice caps, if an asteroid or comet hit the ice caps and melted them, that would release a hell of a lot of water into the oceans, and that would explain it. And they have now researched and found that there is evidence of that. Multiple, actually.
Yeah. I mean, the planet hasn't always been the same. It's changed over time, and I think that's something people don't like to get their heads around. There was a time Greenland was a place that people farmed because the land was so fertile. Now it's not. It's just the Earth has changed over time. The climate. I mean, the Sahara Desert was a jungle.
Right. I was just going to say that. The Sahara Desert was a lush tropical paradise at one point. And we know this because they've found, they know they do I guess they do a core sample, they dig into the earth, and they take it out, and they can tell by the layers, they can scientifically figure out what was going on. Which, when you say the Sahara, that brings up the other thing about Egypt is that theory that, when you say there's a theory that the Sphinx is older than it appears, it sounds like, well, who's postulating that theory? Some crazy? No, it's actually Dr. Robert Schoch, associate professor of natural science at Boston University. And he's not the only one, but he's one of the main ones, where he looked at the erosion on the side of the Sphinx and said, hey, this looks like other examples of erosion of stone where it was subjected to heavy rainfall for a period of several thousand years or something like that.
It's almost inconceivable.
And it's like, well, that hasn't happened in quite a while. And they said, well, actually, we do know that the Sahara Desert was under heavy rainfall 12,000 years ago. We know that because they have determined that happened, but that can't be because the Sphinx was built much later. Was it?
But they don't know that. And it's interesting on many levels, but one thing that's interesting to me is this. They say, oh, it hasn't rained at that pace and that volume in 11, 12,000 years. Am I correct? Mm-hmm. Well, they certainly didn't build it while it was raining like that. Right. So it's if you are going older. It has to be older than that because nobody builds things while it's been raining for 2,000 years.
Right. It's a hell of a rainstorm. Let's get out there and build something. And also, when you look at it, it's the Sphinx. And why do we call it a Sphinx? It's because it's got the body of a lion. It's got the head of a man. And that's what we call a Sphinx. But the head looks a little smaller, doesn't it? Like the head is not proportional. When you look at it, you go, that's a small head on top of a big lion body.
some researchers believe that it was an animal, maybe a lion.
It was a lion, yeah.
And that they changed it to a pharaoh later on.
Right, and maybe it got damaged. Maybe the head got massively damaged,
Right.
and they carved it, and they carved what was left of it into a human head, because that would explain the proportional discrepancy of
It's very long.
Right, it's doesn't look like it was intended to be a human head. It looks like it was whatever was left was carved down to that. And the other interesting fact is, it just happens to be facing a way that you would have approximately 12,500 years ago. The Sphinx would have been looking out to the Leo rising over the winter solstice. Like it's aligned to see a certain, cosmic event. And if you go back far enough, that cosmic event would have in fact been Leo, the lion. So that kind of does make sense. Like you're honoring Leo astrological sign, so you build a lion to gaze out over where it comes up. But that offers all sorts of time problems when you go, well, that can't be, because nobody 12,000 years ago built big structures, right, Steve?
Well, that's what they say, right? And
that was the argument for a long time, and it was true because they had no evidence of it.
It's still being said.
Well, after Göbekli Tepe, that has all kind of gone out the window.
Right, it has, Chris. And part of the issue I have with that, so Göbekli Tepe. I'm sorry. You say it. You say it better than I do.
It's Göbekli. Yeah, it's very hard. If you try to say it fast, it's Göbekli Tepe.
Okay, it's in Turkey.
Right.
And there's actually a few sites in the area that they've uncovered
so
far. And even that site, Göbekli Tepe, that they, I'm going to butcher the word.
Just call it GT.
GT, baby. Even that site, I want to say 80-90% of it has still been still unearthed.
Oh yes, only about 5% of it has been excavated as of 2021.
Okay,
and they have dated it to 10,000 plus years, and that is not even a question.
That's not a question, and that's just what they've unearthed so far.
Right,
they know there's more because they've done their
ground penetrating radar.
Right, there's more. So
much more.
Who knows what that's going to be?
Right, but the fact of the matter is that it was purposefully buried. That's the other part of it that's weird, is they know, and they know this because they can actually tell that the earth that's over this, that they uncovered it, the earth is not over time, it layers. Right. They know that it actually all went there at the same time. Right. It was purposefully buried very carefully, almost as if to preserve it. And because of that, they can date the organic material. You cannot carbon date stone. You have to pick the organic, which is how they come to the determination, hey, we found this thing in this stone structure. This thing dates to this. So I guess this stone structure must have been built the same time. That's kind of the equivalent of you move out of this house, Steve, and you leave a newspaper. And the newspaper is the only thing that survives, and somebody comes along and goes, well, this newspaper says, June 2022. So obviously that's when this structure was built.
Right.
You have no basis for that. You're just picking something inside and saying, well, it must have been.
Right.
But they know, because they're able to date the organic material, that these huge structures of Göbekli Tepe were made over 10,000, 11,000, 12,000 years ago. They have zero explanation of who made them and why.
They have no explanation. They know that they find a lot of human skull fragments in the area. That's a lot of what gets dated. Right. There's other things too, plants and things like that. Why they keep finding skull fragments, I don't know. Nobody knows. But they also find depictions of people carrying skulls. What's that all about? Headless humans and headless statues. And they also find kind of carved out reliefs of different animals. A lot of those animals aren't even from that area.
Right.
They know that. They can't find where anyone would have lived that could have built such a structure. And some of these pillars that are there, these pillars that are almost like a T shape, some of these pillars are 4 or 5 tons. And I guess let's get to one of my major points I have is the traditional archaeology tells us that from the time humans were modern humans for, let's call it 200,000 years, right? Up until the first civilization of Sumeria, we were hunter-gatherers.
Right.
So they want to tell us, even today, that it's hunter-gatherers that built that.
That's how they explain it. They say, well, I guess some hunter-gatherers just stopped about 12,000 years ago, and they looked at each other and they go, why are we wandering around following these animals? Why don't we just build a big stone structure?
Right.
All right, let's do it. And then they just knew how to do it, and they were able to organize. You can't build a structure like that if you're a hunter-gatherer. If you're a hunter-gatherer, you have enough food to get you to the next hunt time.
That's it.
You don't have enough surplus to coordinate a huge effort of hauling multi-ton stones and then putting them up very, very specifically. Like, it's not like they just threw them up there. They're placed in such ways that are like, you'd have to have some math behind it. You're not a hunter-gatherer suddenly just doing this.
So far they've found 3 what you call them enclosures at Göbekli Tepe. GT. I'm sorry, Chris. I keep screwing it up. They call them enclosures. They're kind of round with walls. It almost looks like a maze if you're looking at it from above. They call them Neolithic because they're from the Stone Age, right? Structures that are built. If you draw a line through the center of them, they have 3 so far. It makes a triangle.
Right. They line them up.
Yeah. There's forethought before it's built. There's planning. So people say, hunter-gatherers. It's a cop-out, right?
Oh.
I think it's a cop-out because someone doesn't want to admit there might have been a civilization before. So hunter-gatherers. All right. So I know we already talked about it, but you go from 200,000 years, 5,000 years, boom, we have all this knowledge. Well, we still have hunter-gatherer cultures on our planet today.
Some of which don't even know we exist, which is funny to think about, right?
So what do we got? I was looking it up. The Inuits up in Canada, they had monoliths, right? You know what they are? They're just, do you know what a cairn is when you go hiking? You ever seen one?
Yeah.
It's kind of like those rocks
pile
that
of
are built.
stones.
That's what it is. That's what they built out of stones that it looks like maybe if you got 6 or 8 guys, they could pick them up. That's what they have. How do they live? They live in igloos. And when it's warm out, they live in tents. That's it. That's their culture. They eat seals. They eat reindeer. They're not creating math. They're not creating language in terms of any high-level education, high-level thinking.
And it's funny because they know we exist. And they know they could have more, and they just have no interest. And there's also some tribes in the Amazon. And isn't there an island off the coast of, I want to say, is it India? I believe it's India maybe. But there's a small island that you can't even approach because the military keeps an eye on it because there is a tribe living there that has zero interest in engaging with anyone else. And I think they kill anyone who comes onto their island.
Yes. Yeah. There's one in Paraguay, Bolivia. Do they have monoliths? No, they don't build anything. They don't build anything.
No, hunter-gatherers can't really build anything.
I could go through all of them, and I'm not going to. But there's a bunch of hunter-gatherer civilizations, if that's what you want to call them, tribes. They have nothing on the scale of what they're finding in Turkey. Zero.
Right.
And for some reason, Chris, these people that are living today have had an extra 10,000 years of knowledge, and they still have come up with nothing. Yet we're supposed to believe that the people back then just built that.
And when you say they're lined up, the implications of that, you have to stop and think. If you line up 2 things that are in sight, it's still pretty hard. Like, it's not easy. If you're trying to line up things that you can't see, like these sites are not like right next to each other. There's some distance between them. You can't see site B from site A, but yet site B is laid out in exact alignment with site A. That takes sophisticated math of some degree to figure that out, because it's not like you can see the 2 things at the same time. You have to mathematically align them to understand where on the horizon they point so you can make sure they point at each other. Like, that's not a skill that hunter-gatherers are going to have or need.
Well, it lines up to an equilateral triangle, which means all sides are the same. They're the same distance. So it takes some forethought. It takes some planning. And the question that I have, and I think that a lot of people have, is, okay, the hunter-gatherers decided to build this. Why?
What was
Why?
its purpose, right?
Why, if you had a society that needed to continue to hunt, it was the men that generally hunted,
Right.
why would they waste their energy on something that was going to, if you look at it, is going to take years to build instead of feeding their family and their tribe?
You would.
It doesn't make any sense.
Only a civilization or only a society that has a surplus can build huge projects. That's why nothing was really built. They tell us that. Nothing was built until we stopped being hunter-gatherers and we planted, crops. And they say that was about 5,000 years ago. So then you find something from 10,000 years ago that obviously, and they say, well, I guess those wanderers built that too. And it's like, well, you already told us that didn't happen at all until we settled down. So now you're saying, well, we had this little spurt where we just kind of built some stuff, and then we said, well, let's wander around a little bit. Well, that was a bad idea. One of the other facts that I read about Göbekli Tepe is that as they're uncovering, and again, only 5% has been excavated, but of what they have identified, the older stuff is of better quality than the more recent stuff.
That's
Again,
interesting because it's just like Egypt.
Just like Egypt. The quality started out at a certain level and declined the further we got from there. That makes zero sense. That hunter-gatherers could do it, but certainly that they would come out of the gate with such strong skills and then have them decline over time. And then, of course, there's the question of the large mammoths that disappeared about 12,000 years ago in North America.
There were just humongous graveyards in North America and Siberia of just tens of thousands of mammoths. I mean, it's all different kinds of
that were killed at like an instant. Like it wasn't like they were killed over time. It was like they were killed around the same time.
Oh yeah, and I was reading
one big event.
Some of them, their legs are just broken, and they're just laying there with broken legs. And it's always been explained, I guess you'd say, that by overhunting. But if you look at it and go back, at that time when that happened, there were more mammoths, let's say, than people.
Right. How could people have hunted them? And how could they without any kind of advance? Like
you could hunt one maybe with a bunch of guys.
You can't kill off a species of large mammals with just gumption.
No.
Like that. It's
something happened.
A lot of this stuff, if you stop and actually think about it and actually play it through your head, you go, well, yeah, obviously that doesn't make any sense. Or, yeah, that sounds like a more plausible explanation. But as I said, people's first instinct, if you bring this up, is to just, oh, that's crazy talk. But actually look at some of the data, and then you start to say, wow, there's something here. One of the interesting sort of pieces of evidence that leads one to think this is something called the Perry-Reese map. Have you ever heard of this map?
Yes.
So this was a medieval map that apparently was made by Perry-Reese. He was a Turkish cartographer and admiral. He was around in like the 1513, that time frame, right? So he made this map, and we only have a piece of it. We only have a corner of it, but it was at one point a world map that he made. But he claimed, or actually didn't claim, he stated on it, he didn't map this himself. He had older maps that he had in his possession. He was in Turkey. Older maps that probably came, I think they say these maps came from the Library of Alexandria. So the Library of Alexandria, which was,
that was in Egypt.
Yeah, and that was sacked before the Dark Ages. And so that kind of
right. Well, they had a fire, right?
It was Julius Caesar burned it in like 48 BC.
And then anything that remaining was just pretty much plundered.
There was another Roman invasion in like 275 AD, and they actually destroyed it. And some of the documents were saved. Much was lost. Most was lost. I don't even want to think about what was lost. It's tragic how much was lost. But what was saved was actually brought to Constantinople, which is why it ended up in the hands of Perry-Reese. So he made this map, and he pieced it together from other maps. We have a corner of it, and it has some very interesting, let's just say, discrepancies that makes one go, huh, that's odd.
Go ahead.
All right. So, first of all, it shows Antarctica, whereas we didn't discover Antarctica until 1818. We didn't even know Antarctica was a thing.
Right.
But this map, which is from 1513, but also the land doesn't look like it did in 1513. We know what that land looks like, but we also know what that land looks like 12,500 years ago, and the coastlines more match up to the older date than the date that it was made.
I find this fascinating.
So that's one, is just having Antarctica is one. So when they saw it in the coastline, they were like, "Oh, this coastline's wrong. This guy was a quack." And then years later, it's like, "Oh wait, this is what the coastline looked like 12,000 years ago." Well, wouldn't you know, it's the same.
You know what's funny? We keep splitting hairs. I think that's what it is with archaeology today. 5,000 years, 12,000 years, 15,000 years. In the grand scheme of this planet, it's nothing. It's a microcosm.
Yep.
Arguing over 5 or 10,000 years, it's nothing. But if the archaeology mainstream relented, it just throws all their work out the window.
Right.
I think that's the hesitancy.
Traditionally, archaeologists haven't really looked at anything but archaeological data. They haven't looked at geological data. They haven't looked at genetics. That's another thing that's kind of causing some questions, is because now with genetics, they can actually trace, and there was something where they found some strain of Aborigine from Australia DNA in South America, but that same DNA was not at all represented in Central America or North America, which means the theory of the people coming to North America from the land bridge, that puts that into question, because if people migrated, then that DNA strain would be found throughout, but it's only found in isolated places. Like the questions of how we even got here, and then when you stop that and you go, well, what was here before? What did this land look like before? You start to just think about it and go, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. Are you really telling me that this piece of land, America, North America, South America, you're really telling me for most of the history of this planet, it sat unused? Like,
right.
There's so many resources here. We were psyched to find it, the English. Not we, I wasn't part of the expedition, but I'm just saying, we as a people were pretty psyched to find, hey, this is big land. There's nobody living here. It's perfectly open. And they're like, well, we native people, we live here. It's totally open. Nobody lives here.
Don't worry about it.
But when the Spanish first came over to these shores, there was a Spanish explorer who went through the Amazon, and he came with tales of huge cities, huge metropolises dotting the Amazon. But when the Spanish finally returned after many years, there was no trace. And so they just assumed that he made it all up and it was all just BS. Now they're finding, with ground-penetrating radar in the Amazon, and as the Amazon is getting cleared, they're finding the remains of these cities that they think millions of people lived in. And when the Spanish came through that first time, they brought in like smallpox inadvertently and basically wiped out millions of people, and then the jungle just took it over. It was considered to be like, there were no huge cities. Oh, the Mayans, okay, we'll give you the Mayans. Or, there's a few Aztecs, okay, we'll give you that. But they were like, no, there's no huge civilizations here. And then, okay, well, we found the remains of these huge cities that don't exist anymore, and explain that. And we just don't. We just, archaeologists will just go, well, hunter-gatherers just got, randy one day and decided to build some stuff. It makes no sense if you even think about it for 30 seconds.
It makes zero sense. Something I found interesting, the Sumerians, the cradle of civilization. That's we've always been taught,
yep.
Right? Well, they came up with the schools. They came up with time. They came up with so many different things. We come up with it, right? Which, if you really think about it, how did you do that, right? But let's just take that out of the equation for a second.
They were just really good one day.
Right. To this day, nobody can find DNA in anywhere else in this world that matches the people that lived in Sumeria, except one place. They live in the area which was where the Phoenicians lived, and they are kind of like where Lebanon would be now, okay. Right? Can't remember the name of the group, but it's a very small group. They're kind of isolated from other people. And guess what they know how to do better than anyone else?
What's that?
Build boats. So it's kind of interesting that that's the DNA that got passed from Sumeria, and the only people that are remaining on this planet are master boat builders. Yet, if you look back far enough, like we were talking about, maybe the people that started Sumeria were the survivors of a flood. I mean, it kind of, you look at it and you say, this all is pretty interesting.
Right. And oftentimes the ancient legends will say something along the lines of there was a great calamity, there was a great flood, many, things were destroyed, and these higher beings came and taught us how to do this. They gave us the knowledge. They don't say like higher beings as in, they just basically mean people advance. What would happen to us today if something similar came and, some of our people survived and made it down to, let's say, the Amazon jungle or wherever, and kind of made it with made it into these camps and said, hey, stuff went bad out there. Can I crash with you guys? I can show you some stuff. And, things would happen. It wouldn't be great, but it would, things would be different. And then it would just go from there. It makes tons of sense. Again, it's when you think of the time frame, it almost seems implausible that it didn't happen.
Well, it's funny when you say people with a higher intelligence that they might have come from somewhere else. In Sumeria, there was they had the gods, the Anunnaki. You ever hear about that?
Yes.
All right. And there was this one guy, and he's always been looked at kind of as like, maybe he's a quack, right? He wrote this book years ago, 1976. His name is Zechariah Sitchin.
Oh, yes, I have heard of him, yes.
All right, and the story is kind of crazy. Have you ever heard he says this is his interpretation of the text he read from Sumeria, which, again, I'll say the language kind of interests me only because language is something that people that study it will tell you it builds on itself. Even today in different languages, there is evidence of ancient languages in our languages now.
Right? Pieces of it still exist.
We have Latin in our English. It's very prevalent in Spanish, Italian, things like that.
Right. That's how you can trace back a language and kind of see how it developed, because you can kind of see where pieces of it came from different things.
They have no idea where Sumerian language came from. Zero. It's just kind of interesting. So the Anunnaki are supposed to be, according to this guy that Zechariah Sitchin, he said that his interpretation of the text were that the Anunnaki were gods that came from a planet hundreds of thousands of years ago, right? And they wanted to come here because their planet was kind of not doing well. And their planet orbits our sun every 3,600 years.
Right, because it's further out, or it's in a certain way that we would never encounter it, because it's always going to be on the opposite side of us.
But it happened to be close to us at this time, right? So they came here because they knew we had gold. And they came here with another race of people that were their slaves. And they came here to have them dig gold. Well, those slaves kind of revolted. So the Anunnaki killed all of them. And then they said, what are we going to do? So they looked at primitive people and they made humans. This is this theory to mine gold for them. And you say to yourself, and these Anunnaki were supposed to be kind of larger people. And you say to yourself, what is this crazy story? I kind of think it's crazy. It's kind of crazy. But I always like to look into things. That's what I do.
It's certainly an interesting story. They
have located a gold mine in South Africa, kind of on the border where Tanzania would be. So it's kind of on the coast of, I don't know if that's the Indian Ocean.
Okay.
Over there. Erosion, which we talked about earlier, Dr. Schock, I think, from Boston University. So not the same person, but the same kind of analysis.
So they can date how old it is, basically.
Through erosion.
Right.
They date it to 190,000 years ago, this gold mine. And outside of this gold mine is a city. There are stone structures that make a city. And on the walls of this city are paintings that some of these archaeologists believe are the same. No, this is 190,000 years ago. The same gods that are depicted in some Egyptian paintings.
Wow.
Now, is it all 100%? I don't know. This planet. NASA has come out and said it is more likely than not. I don't know if you heard of the planet X.
I have heard of that theory, yes.
They have now said it's more likely than not that planet exists. It's in our solar system. It's way outside of Pluto. And they believe it orbits the sun every 10,000. They can't find it yet, but they say based on what they're seeing with gravity and things, with the light, they're almost positive it's there.
It's fascinating to think that we sort of assume astronomers are looking through a telescope and seeing kind of the same thing somebody would see if they were peeping on their neighbors with a telescope. But really, a lot of what we know of what's outside of in our solar system and all that, it's gravity from light reflecting. There is some open question, and I have heard the question of the theory of that planet X. Now, Zecharia Sitchin, I have never looked into him myself. I have heard some critique of him by people who also subscribe to the idea of an ancient civilization. So they're not hostile to the whole idea, but they do say that some of Zechariah's interpretations are very broad. Like he takes some liberties to make some connections to make the story he's trying to tell work, but there's enough there that something is up. There's connections that you can find throughout our whole world of ancient civilizations who should have not had any contact with each other, yet have a very similar, wouldn't say it's exact, but they have just a very similar outlook on things. And you just start to question, could it be the same source and you took it in this direction and this one took it in another direction? Our technological path was not inevitable. We, as a society, chose a path technologically. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. There were other junctions when other ways could have been explored that we'll never know about, because once we started going down a certain path, we just followed that.
Right. What if we followed
leverage machines?
Right. What if we followed something besides the combustible engine? Who knows what it would have, instead of the steam engine? Where do we go? Where would it have happened?
So what you'll hear a lot is when you bring Atlantis into things, one is sometimes people will it starts to get weird. It starts to get kind of like, because there's some theories out there of like Atlantis having like superior technology. And then you lose people because there is no evidence of that. Anytime when you hear somebody saying like spaceships and stuff in Atlantis, that's pure speculation. There is nothing to support that. But there is something to support that whatever existed, they understood longitude. Because again, I go back to the Perry-Reese map. It had longitude, which again, we as a people, we didn't even know that longitude was a thing until around like 1790. Before that, we didn't have an accurate way of measuring that. And they get, like, I guess it was a chronometer, and that's how you needed to be able to, once you had that, you were able to actually tick off and figure out longitude. Yet this old map, again, supposedly drafted around 1513, but admittedly was from older maps that were much, much older. They have longitude. So whatever existed, they weren't flying spaceships, but they at least had it down to be able to map the world. They mapped the entire world, and that's where those maps came from that show things that we didn't discover until much later. So again, once you start piecing it together, it's hard to not at least be attracted to the idea that, all right, something was here, and then something bad happened on this planet. As we know, this planet does go through stuff occasionally. We have nothing to do with that stuff, some of it. Look at the moon. The moon's pretty pocked and cratered from things whacking it. And one has to imagine that over the how long, I have the stat here. It's they say the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. That's their guess.
Yep.
Again, 4.5 billion years. A billion seconds being 31 years when you try to, just put that in your mind. So with the Earth having been around for that long, who knows what kind of stuff whacked into it time? What is it? Is it Jupiter supposedly is like our big hero because Jupiter gets hit by a lot of things that would otherwise whack into us, right?
Yes. So it's a protector, but it also causes some issues because of the way its gravity, which is what it does all of this because it's so large, which is actually, they think this other planet might be that big that's out there. But it also creates a slingshot problem sometimes, and it speeds up things that come faster at us.
Okay.
It does both. And I think it protects more, but it also has this this I don't know what you want to call it, but if something can circle it and then shoot back out of it and escape the gravity, it comes out at a faster rate.
Right. So it's our protector, but it also could be of harm to us if something hits it, right?
Right.
And comes slingshotting at us. I don't really think people like to even dwell on how bad we could be screwed if something like that happened. Like, it's not something you could necessarily see coming. Like I said, if it's coming from certain directions, we won't see it. It doesn't take much, for, what was that? What was that one that blew up over the Tunguska?
Tunguska.
Yeah.
In Russia, but it blew up in the air.
Right.
It didn't hit the ground.
And it leveled the trees underneath it. And they said if that had gone off over a populated area, you could have been looking at like hundreds of thousands dead.
And it wasn't even that big.
It wasn't that big. It was a blip, but yet and that's not even the only thing. When they used to play around with the idea of like what kind of calamities could have taken place on this Earth, getting hit by an asteroid meteor, that's one of them. Volcanoes, that's another one, right? I mean, I'm sure you've watched those things about under Yellowstone.
Oh, right.
That super volcano basically saying all the time, like, don't worry, we're pretty sure it's not going to go off for a long time. Oh, by the way, but if it did go off, we're all dead. Like all of us. Doesn't matter where you are, we're all dead. But don't worry, it's not going to happen.
They call that a caldera.
And it's like a super volcano. Like it is one that when it goes, and it will go at some point, it will wreak such havoc that not much will survive anywhere near it.
We're jumping around a little bit, but there's theories that happened in the Mediterranean around the time of Moses, and I think it's called Krakatoa.
Krakatoa, okay, yeah.
And they think that might have been the nexus for the story about the parting of the Red Sea, because after Krakatoa, there would have been a tidal wave, and before the tidal wave, all the seas would have receded, and it would have created a path through the Red Sea, which then created that story. Unless you believe the story,
right. No, it's so you have asteroids and comets, then you have volcanoes that could blow, and then it's just the sun that gives us warmth and gives us life, and all that can also kill us because it occasionally blasts. The sun occasionally blasts these what is it? Basically like discharges at us, which would wreak havoc with electronics.
A flare,
right?
Flare,
like a solar flare. And so far, they haven't been that bad. Although they have done some damage. But they say if a big one ever hit us now, with how much we depend on machinery and electronics, we could be out of power, all of us, like everyone, because it would overload it would just overload everything. And people could be out of power for years.
Well, think about that. If we, as a society, right now, 2022, lost our power grid just for a year.
Oh, it wouldn't even take that much.
Just saying.
Right.
However you want to phrase
If you lost it for a couple of days, that initial thing, and you see it happen, when something like that happens, initially we band together. Initially, you see it in every natural disaster. People band together. That only lasts so long.
It only lasts as long as the resources are plentiful.
If it goes for a couple of days and we can get back on our feet, great. If it goes for a week, if it goes for a month, if it goes for 6 months, if it goes for a year, you start to see the fractures. You start to see all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's not let's all band together. It's I better bunker down with mine to make sure that there's enough for, we're probably they say we're like a couple of missed meals from total anarchy. Like all it would take is just a disruption to our life.
That's all it would. I mean, we wouldn't have the internet.
Most people would have no idea how to get anywhere because they use GPS.
You'd have nothing. We would be crippled. We'd basically be crippled, right? And I know a lot of people, I'll go hunt my food. Okay, sure you will. It'd be very few people that are skilled enough to actually pull that kind of stuff off. Right?
Certainly to hunt enough to sustain any. You might get lucky and bag an animal here and there, but you're not going to be able to hunt.
No,
reliably.
and then try hunting them and stopping the other people from taking what you just hunted. It's just chaos. It would be anarchy, and our society would just collapse on itself within a year. And then think about what that would be 10,000 years from now if somebody else came along to try to see. Right?
What would they see? What would be left? And what would they piece together of what was here and what we did? No,
it would just be fables. It'd be fables and stories, Chris, because everything we have is digital.
Yeah.
It would all be gone. Everything would be gone. They'd find a few things and say, I guess this is how they lived. I guess this is what they did. But they really wouldn't know. They'd be in the position we're in now trying to figure out stuff.
Right, and making wild, broad leaps with like very little evidence. Because you're right, not a lot of what we have would exist very long. I mean, a lot of our stuff it's not built to last the ages. It's built to last.
Even a car, even a boat. I'm talking like ships. Give them 15, 20, 100 years, gone.
Yeah.
There's no trace that it's even existed. And everyone's like, well, it's steel. Well, it's going to rust away. It's going to be gone.
Stone
it's
is
all going to be gone.
Stone is about the only thing you're going to have that lasts. And even that, it has to be big stone because little stone can crumble.
Right.
It's the big stone, like we said, Mount Rushmore, the pyramids, those things would still survive. Mostly everything else, nobody would be able to even tell we were here. And let's face it, if something bad happened on this planet, our society, and I mean like our whole society, I'm talking about like the whole planet, like the civilized world, let's just call it, we are in the worst position to be able to survive because nobody really knows how to do anything. Like maybe we know how to do one piece of it, and that's it. And then we count on a very complex system to keep everything else going. If you take that system down, it's not going to be pretty.
No. Most people do not farm their own food. Most people don't hunt their own meat. You go to the grocery store because a person has a particular skill, whatever that might be. They're a plumber. They're a doctor. Whatever it is, that's their contribution to society because that's the only way we can do it.
Right.
And live in an actual society the way we live in. But we're all dependent on each other. But when the time comes, you probably shouldn't depend on each other.
And our supermarkets are sort of built on this idea that food comes in every couple of days and replenishes it. Like there's not a huge store. Like we don't keep a lot of food in our cities. We ship it in daily to constantly keep it full. If everything broke down, it would be like, what, a day or a couple of days, and the supermarket shelves would be empty, and there would be nothing more coming, and everything would just sort of fall apart. We're just not built to last like that. Like, we think as a society we're super strong and we're super resilient. We're not. I mean, we're good in a lot of ways, but we're not built to last through prolonged adversity. We can handle bumps. We're pretty good at that. Like, we can handle something bad happens, but it's a pocket of things and there's support around it. We figure that out. But if something really large and prolonged took place and just took away everything that we depend on, we'd fracture in like so quickly.
And I think it's probably that. Add one other aspect to that situation. The aspect would be nobody knows when it's going to end. Right. So, yeah, if you told somebody this is happening in a year, it's going to be over with, people have a different mind frame.
The sad part is, though, at least as far as like getting hit by like an asteroid or comet, even taking into account like the difficulty of seeing with things, we are actually at a technological point where if we put our mind to it, we could figure it out. Like we could have detectors theoretically far enough out to be able to give us some warning. If we knew something was going to hit us and we had some warning, there's like things we could do. I mean, we're not going to be like Armageddon and like send Bruce Willis up or anything, but I think I've heard that they can just cause an explosion or not even that.
To take it off its track.
I think you can actually paint one of the sides
because
it's
the sun
light.
will hit it harder.
The sunlight is what moves objects like that. So if it's drifting towards us and you paint one side, it suddenly gets more sunlight, and that'll actually alter its course.
Maybe you send like an astronaut with like a can of spray paint.
Yeah, like a tag to tag it. You know, and and again, the further out you catch it, you don't even have to move it that much. You just move it just a tiny little bit, and then by the time it gets here, it misses us. So it's just sad that we actually do have the technical ability to possibly prevent that from happening.
Right.
The civilization that existed before, they may have been able to see something coming because there is some evidence, some weird evidence here and there that there were some among them that knew something was coming, but they were powerless to stop it. There was nothing they could do. They could just see that it was coming.
Well, I mean, even in the Bible, some of the people knew that the flood was coming.
Right.
How did they know that? But,
And-
when we were talking about people, how they treat each other, I just thought of one thing I had to say it. If anyone listening, really thinks in a crisis that people are going to help each other, go watch a video about a Black Friday sale.
Right. Yes, you see all of humanity on display.
Yeah, they're
in
fighting
its full
over
glory.
a $10 mop.
Yeah.
That's on sale for $3.
As long as things are plentiful, we're perfectly happy to be friendly and giving. And as soon as there's a perception of a scarcity, we lock into defend mode and keep away, and it just gets bad. So, like I said, unlike that theoretical civilization, we might get our act together and possibly be able to prevent that. But I think it just makes, like I said, it makes people uncomfortable just even pondering that. When I bring this up to people, they get uncomfortable because they don't even like to think. Because once you go down that road, it opens your eyes and it makes you go, huh. So this wasn't assured. Someone else maybe thought they were going to be the ones that it was all about. And then you question, like, we have some evidence that there was something before us, but there's still a lot of unaccounted time, like 196,000 years approximately, that anatomically, modern humans existed. So we think it's unlikely that 5,000 years ago they just suddenly got their act together. But even this just brings it out to let's be generous and say 20,000 years.
Now, it's a very broad analogy, but it would be as if someone today was working at a labor job, and then at 60 years old, they just started doing surgery. You'd say, well, where did you get this knowledge? How did you do this?
Right, you're exhibiting a skill set that you have never shown before, but all of a sudden it just pops up.
Right. Where did it go? How? Why? How? I mean, I think most people would really want to know about this man or woman.
It's funny to think that if you just look at what's obvious, let's look at what's agreed upon, even if you take out the things that are contested. If you just look at what's agreed upon, you start to see holes, and if you start to question it, and you're immediately shut down for questioning it, like, oh, what are you, some kind of pseudoscientist? And it's like, well, no, I'm taking your data and I'm looking at it and I'm reading it. Am I understanding it properly? Explain it to me. Is this what you mean? Okay, then if this, well, how does this work? They don't want you to question it. They just want you to, don't worry about it. We have the past figured out. We know everything that took place before we got here, and it wasn't much, because we're the shit. We're awesome. We're so good. Nothing was happening until we decided to start. But then, if you start to think, how many fledgling civilizations got to some point? I mean, we think the theory is that the one before us got approximately 18th century, not to say that they seem like the 18th century, it's just the equivalent knowledge of sailing the seas and stuff like that is kind of what the theory is, right? But what if before that there was one that didn't make it very far at all? What if they were still in like the actual like building huts, and then something happened and they were, you know what I'm saying? Like, potentially this thing could have started multiple times, and then if somebody says, well, why is there no evidence? Are you kidding me? If a flood wiped across the land as the geologists think happened, nothing is going to be left. In some cases, not even the land itself. It's now beneath the ocean. Like, there's no evidence of this stuff, but we never look for it because we don't look there, because archaeologists tell us there's nothing to find, so they don't dig below a certain level in the United States, at least. Like, they don't dig below it because they already know there's nothing to find because humans weren't here. We start with the assumption there's nothing to find. Therefore, we won't dig beneath this level because obviously there's nothing to find. And I love it when Avi Loeb, the Harvard professor, He has a funny thing. It's like he's like closing your blinds and saying, "I must not have any neighbors because I can't see them."
Right.
That's his equivalent of like saying you're not looking for it because you assume it's not there. It's the self-protective thing. And then if you bring up some obvious problems with that, they call you a pseudoscientist. They call you a pseudo-archaeologist, or the big one, conspiracy theorist. As soon as they call you a conspiracy theorist, that means whatever they're saying, it's crap. And some conspiracy theories are a little out there. But this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is just a theory of what took place on this planet before we started keeping accurate records. It's all just a guess, man.
I don't understand why it's such a crazy thought process to say, all right, so now they're unearthing Göbekli Tepe, GT, baby.
GT.
And they're saying, all right, so what we know so far, it's 11 to 12,000 years old. Well, why is it so crazy to think there might be something under that?
They know there's more. Like
no,
there's so much.
But like, there's
Even
something
deeper?
that even the people that lived then would have excavated if they had the ability to do it. Why is everything just one level down and that's it?
Because it starts to open up very uncomfortable questions for us. You know, we circle back around to like it's everything about this entire society from our major religions, like everything about it says this was the start. There was nothing. It started. It's been going. It's going. We're it. If you change the order of any of that, then you start to question everything. And that gets very uncomfortable for people to suddenly lose that support structure of their beliefs that have kept them kind of... You see that in the UFO issue. People don't even want to go down that road because it just starts opening up questions that they don't want to address because it makes them uncomfortable. It makes them unsure of our place in the universe. Like before that, we knew our place. Like, you know, we said with no, and I say we as a people, kind of claimed for a long time with no irony at all. This whole thing out here, completely empty. This whole city is completely empty except for this one little neighborhood and this one little house in this little neighborhood. This whole, actually, even bigger than that, this whole country is completely devoid of people except for this city, this street, and this one house
right
on that street, in that city. We're here, but everything... And we said it like it was, and NASA backed it up. Yeah, there's chances of a planet being something that people could live on. And now they say, well, actually, we recalculated that. Actually, there's an absurd number of planets that are probably like ours, like almost too many to count. Like, it's gone from there are none to there are more than we can possibly count.
Right.
We didn't have that knowledge a short time ago.
Right.
So why do we assume that all the knowledge we have now is all? Like, we do that every time, is we assume that...
Because we're arrogant.
Every single time. And every single time we're proven wrong, we just go with it and pretend Galileo said, you know, hey, guys, the Earth probably isn't the center. It's probably the sun. We're probably circling it. And they thought it was heresy and they were going to throw him in jail and kill him and all this. Turns out he was right. Now that's our thought process. Before that, if you'd asked, they would have said, no, we know it all. We know, we figured it all out. Why do we keep assuming that we have it all? We have a piece. We have a part. There's some we'll never know.
Well, it's funny. It's in the Bible. After the flood is over, God supposedly says to Noah and his sons, be fruitful and replenish the earth.
Right.
Well, that means it was full to begin with.
Right.
Before the flood.
It's funny how they use that. It uses the word replenish.
Yeah. And be fruitful, which means
have lots of kids.
Have lots of kids.
And replenish the earth. And no one ever stops and goes, wait, do you mean it was plenished before?
It's like, that part is not real. You can't pick and choose.
Right. The amount, I think about the amount of knowledge that was lost in the Library of Alexandria. Like the amount of stuff.
That's one of the 7 wonders of the world, right?
Yes. And it had, it had been there, and it basically had somewhere between, they say, like 40,000 to 400,000 scrolls. Sort of the equivalent of 100,000 books is what they're what they estimate it to be, right? They think it was established around 285 BC, and just it was the center of knowledge. All knowledge was brought there. And then when it was destroyed, some of it was saved, most of it wasn't. And even that, very little exists today from that. What was lost? I mean, obviously there was a lot of knowledge of some sort. We're never going to know what that was. And so how can we say with any certainty that we're pretty sure of how the world has gone up to this point when, as we pointed out, we're very narrow in our time focus. We don't understand that time's huge. We don't understand our place, that where we are today with our knowledge is where we're at, and tomorrow we're going to be a little further. And there's going to be things tomorrow that we know that we didn't know today. And there's things we didn't know yesterday that we know now. Are we ever going to be able to sit back and go, no, we got it all down, we're good? Like, it doesn't make any sense. We don't want to think of it because it makes us uncomfortable. I think it's actually comforting in a weird way.
Maybe on some level it's comforting, Chris, only to know that maybe I say to myself, maybe this go around will get it right.
Right. Maybe there's knowledge that the ancient civilizations had that we've lost, but that doesn't mean it's going to be lost forever. Like maybe they'll find something in Göbekli Tepe. Maybe they'll uncover something. Like, again, they're still working on a very small percentage of it. Maybe they will uncover some piece of knowledge that was lost to us, and we will, if we take it seriously, maybe we can, find every now and then they find an old ancient artifact. I know we'll talk about this at some point, but there's a couple of like ancient Roman artifacts that they've found that they like puzzle them because they're not quite sure what it is or how it works, but it seems more sophisticated than we gave them credit for. Like there's a couple of them throughout history, like these just pockets of things that we find, and it's like, wait, how is this possible? Maybe something like that. That's why I find it comforting. I find almost like if somebody was here before us, maybe they went down a different path, and maybe at some point we'll uncover that path, and maybe it'll be a better path. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true.
Nice to think about. Or maybe we'll all die of a comet hit, and it'll become like Thunderdome here, and I'll probably last like a week. You kidding me? As soon as my cable goes down, I'm like considered it's like a roughing it.
Yeah, where's Netflix?
Yeah, oh my God. When the worst words that someone can ever say to me is, hey, you want to go camping? I go, what, are you kidding me? Like, there's no world in which I would do that. And if that was the world, like if camping was the way life was, I'd be pretty miserable.
You think about sometimes how, I know we're going on about it, but you think about how fragile we are as a society, how dependent we are right now on different kinds of energy. Yeah, if you took electricity out of the equation for this planet and just gave it a week, 2 weeks, it would be chaos. It would be anarchy.
Even if you just took the internet down. Like, let's not even take away electricity. Let's just take the internet down.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
Take
you're
away
right.
Wi-Fi. Most people don't know how to get anywhere. We plug it into the GPS and we hit go. If we suddenly had to read a map, we would be, not all of us, some of us would pick it up. But
I'm going back to the days where I had a map book on my steering wheel.
Right, yeah, exactly. Like, it would be an adjustment, to say the least, to suddenly, I remember having to read a map occasionally when I was young, but there are those who are adults now who have never had to read a map in their entire life. They have always lived in a world where GPS was kind of a thing. So, there's so many of those things. The internet is like, it didn't exist 30 years ago, in any large sense, right? Yet today it is so vital. In 30 years, it became like one of the most important things ever. Most of our businesses, if we lost the internet, we would crumble pretty fast. So it's like, it's not even one thing you have to take out. It's any number of things, and you don't even have to take them out completely. You just have to cripple them for some period of time, and everything else would start to slide.
And here's something crazy. If something happened to this planet, in 100 years, there would probably be no evidence there was even an internet.
No, most of our knowledge, like you said, is digital.
Right.
It's worrying.
If someone came 500 years from now and we were wiped out, and someone came along 500 years ago, what evidence would they ever find that we even had an internet?
Right. So much about our lives would be just data, and it would be the first thing destroyed, the first thing lost, and unrecoverable. Because even with the ancient world, occasionally you can find something somewhere, writing survived, usually on stone. I mean, any kind of books or papyrus is in all likelihood destroyed. But every now and then we find something that gives some knowledge of the past. But we'd have nothing because all of our knowledge is digital, and it's gone from the moment the electricity goes down.
Right.
It's
or
unrecoverable.
let's say it's a book, it's paper. It's not going to last.
Right. And there's no, that I know of, large-scale effort to safeguard our knowledge.
No.
And again, how would you even do that, right? And like, unless you were going to etch it into something that couldn't be destroyed, your only option, I guess, would be to put it in some sort of digital medium. But even then, like, what would be the chance that you'd be able to uncover it? You'd be able to decipher it years from now. Yeah, no, that's why we like talking about this, Steve. And it's, I hope you've out there have enjoyed listening to it. It's bleak. It sounds like it's bleak, but it's not. It's interesting. We keep saying that. Interesting is, I think we overuse that word, I think. But I
was just going to say, I think I'm interested. Well, I find it interesting to begin with, but I think I enjoy learning more about this stuff only because I think that knowing what's happened can help a society move forward. Or else we just keep repeating the same things over and over again. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's very true.
It is very true, right? And that's why I like to go down this road. Like I said, I find it kind of comforting in a way, and also saying, okay, maybe there is hope for us, even though there's evidence that others didn't. We've made it further than anyone, so that's yay on us, right? We've gotten further down the line than we think anyone else so far. Maybe we can be the ones to take it, into the end zone.
We're at the pinnacle, Chris. We're at the point now that people don't have to get out of their cars to eat. They just go to a drive-through. Then they go back home and get on their computer. I mean, I can't imagine. This is the pinnacle of society.
Right. Yeah. It's something. Who knows? I mean, and maybe in a strange way, maybe we need a little shake-up to sort of bring us not back to square one, but maybe we need to be knocked down a few steps just to kind of reassess and say, maybe we didn't want to continue back up in this path. I don't know. Maybe we need kind of not a full reset, but maybe we need a mini reset just to get our heads right. But
just a slap across the face.
Yep. Yeah, that will do us some good. But so anyway, I think that's as good a place to wrap it up. But before we go, I just want to say that if you enjoy Steve and I talking deep shit, there's some things you could really do to help us out. Steve, what could they do to help out the podcast?
You can go onto the app that you're listening to, the platform you're listening to.
Whatever you're listening it on, Spotify, Apple, whatever it is.
Whatever it is you're listening to. You can give us a rating.
Right.
We would appreciate a 5-star rating.
Right. As you give us whatever rating, give us the higher rating of whatever system you use. Sometimes I think it's just a thumb up or whatever.
Good point. A positive rating.
Right. Yes.
And a review. We'd love it. We'd love a review. We love feedback. We're working on a way that you can communicate with us directly.
Yes, we have that. But specifically a 5-star review on Apple, because Apple is the big mama of the podcast world, it seems. So a lot of what happens with podcasts come from how well it's rated and reviewed on Apple. So if you gave us a 5-star review and write a 5-star review for us on Apple, we're going to read it, and we're going to read your words verbatim for whatever. So we actually have a couple, Steve. Can you believe it? We have some 5-star reviews.
Let's hear it.
All right. So the first one now came at the very beginning when we launched, but I'm going to go through them here. So the first one we got was from Amy, and she gave us 5 stars and says, "I've been waiting for you to get this podcast going. Sounds like it's going to be an interesting journey. Looking forward to hearing more." Amy is very supportive of this endeavor, and we appreciate that. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
And then we have someone who put the name in on Apple as Marvelous to You Forever.
Oh, Someone, we got a fan.
Whoever it is, they're marvelous.
Thank you, and I think you're marvelous.
So they have a couple alien heads and saucer, so that appeals to me.
I'm already into this.
Yes, and they say aliens, UFOs, Marvel, which has more aliens. Totally nerding out right now. There's lots to explore and uncover. I like that one. So yes. And lastly, Stephen left us a 5-star review, and he said, I've had the pleasure of chatting with Chris, a very clever and entertaining guy. Oh, flattery is the best way to get. Aside from the 5-star review, if you say nice things about us, then you're going to get read. A very clever and entertaining guy. I'm excited to see where this goes. So
it's not me, by the way, that wrote that.
It's not. No, it's a different Stephen. Now, You're Steve. This is Steven. So, yeah.
Oh, I'm Stephen to my mother.
Oh, that's true. Oh, the confusion grows. But yes, no, this one isn't you. So how can you have and you can get creative with this. You can say something really weird. And again, I'm going to read it.
Yeah. Or I will.
Or one of us will read it verbatim. So, we'll switch it up. So that's how you can help us. And we very much appreciate that. So I think we're going to end it here for now. We're going to be coming back to ancient civilizations. So this is a topic, Steve, both you and I really like.
Yeah, we're going to have to circle back to this.
Yeah. So there'll be a bit of UFOs. There'll be some ancient civilizations. We have a lot of stuff that we want to talk about. It's not all going to be.
And in the meantime, not to interrupt, Chris, but if you have an idea for a show until we get our communication up and running, that you can directly in your review give us an idea.
Right. Exactly.
We'd love to hear it. We'll read it, and we probably will go with it.
Yeah. Give us some ideas for things you'd like to hear us talk about. We like to kick things around. So I think we're going to end it there. So I'm Chris.
And I'm Steve.
And we've been talking about some deep shit.
Yeah!